talk about misinformation, and I'll talk about a variety of studies, mostly meta-analyses, and then some experimental work. I also want to thank my collaborators on these projects, Lance Holbert, Yasmin Morag, Jonathan Cohen, Nikita Salovich, Riva Tokaczynski, and Stephanie Edgerly. And of course, thank my PhD students that work with me and basically allow me to do what I do and support me in all my projects. Let's start with misinformation. So the idea that people are misinformed about health, the environment, science, politics, kind of reached the point of truism. And I'm going to talk a lot about serious stuff today, but let me just start also with some kind of misinformation from the world of produce and just ask you, and you can write in the chat or just think, what is the problem with this image? Well, the obvious problem is that's not an apple, right? That's a banana. That's an apple. Now, the question is whether anyone knows what this is. This is more complicated. Definitely not something that you can get at the grocery store. This is known as the vegetable lamb of Tartary. And although today it's kind of recognized as a medieval myth, for about 400 years in the Middle Ages, people were absolutely certain that there's a tree, and on the tree, there's a fruit that inside of it, there are tiny lambs with flesh and blood and basically everything. It was reported as a fact by naturalists and botanical scholars of the time, not quite scientists, but pretty close. They claim that they have studied it, they've seen it. And as I mentioned, it took about 400 years to recognize this as a myth. And the question is that will kind of keep bugging us today is, why is it so difficult to correct something that is clearly based in misinformation? Anyone knows what this is? This is apricot seeds or apricot kernels. But according to some people, this is also a cure for cancer. So I found this thing on social media. Twice, Jason Vale was diagnosed with cancers that should have killed him. But 30 years after the first tumor has found in his chest, when he was 18, he's still alive. The reason for his survival is not chemo, radiation, cancer drugs, or surgery. Vale claims. He says that he owes his life to a controversial natural product that is making headlines for years: apricot seeds. Now, obviously, not only that it's not a good treatment, in some cases it is deadly. And indeed, Vale and his mother, who had this operation of selling these apricot seeds from quote unquote God, they were arrested. But then there are very similar stuff that you can find. Kind of the myth doesn't go away even if the person goes away. So I found this story. Dr. Ernst Krebs was a biochemist fascinated by the lifestyle habits of the ancient Hanzas, a remote people near northern Pakistan. They enjoyed near perfect health and lived to incredible old age. They didn't have obesity, no heart disease, no cancer. Their secret was the largest quantity of apricot kernels. And just to be completely honest, I didn't know who were the ancient Hanzas. So I did what any sensible researcher would do. I went on Google and I checked on Wikipedia. And this is what I found. Like the first line is that a widely repeated claim of remarkable longevity of the Hanzas people has been refuted. Actually, they died very young, 53 years for men, 52 for women. So not only that they didn't live for long, they were dying pretty fast. And they had all the obesity and all the cancers that one can think. So I checked who was Ernst Krebs, this brilliant doctor, and it's not surprising, he wasn't a doctor. He got his honorary degree from a college that was not accredited to award advanced degrees. And I know what you're saying to yourself. You're saying, Nathan, where do you find this garbage? And you're right, this is on social media. But let's do something a little bit different. Let's go to WebMD, supposedly a reputable website to find information. And I search for cancer as the condition, and I search for apricot kernels as the solution or the treatment. And as you can see, I found 15 reviews from users, and the average ratings for apricot kernels as a treatment for cancer is almost perfect. It's highly effective, it's easy to use, and people are highly satisfied. So that's a problem, because if you do the same search and instead of apricots, you check for chemo or other treatments for cancer, you see that the averages are much, much lower. So this idea that people are misinformed is kind of obvious. When I talk about misinformation, and maybe that's a broader point to make, I see it as cases in which people's beliefs about factual matters are not supported by clear evidence and expert opinion. And this is somewhat different from disinformation, where there's clearer intent to mislead. So in my work, maybe the threshold of what is misinformation is a bit lower. So I know that we're all constantly talking about COVID-19 and vaccines and COVID-19. So I don't want to talk today about COVID, but I do want us to focus a little bit on vaccines, because I think this is such an interesting example. But let's go back to a simpler time. Before COVID, we were just arguing about the efficacy of polio vaccine and the MMR vaccine. So here you can see the number of cases in the US of polio. And you see that around 1955, there's an inflection point and it really drops. And even if I'm not telling you what happened at that exact year, you will know that that's when the vaccine was introduced. And you can see the same thing for diphtheria, and you can see the same thing for whooping cough, and you can see the same thing for measles. The vaccine is introduced and we see a clear drop in cases. However, and that's again before COVID-19, 2019 in the US saw the largest outbreak of measles in the past 25 years. So you kind of have to ask yourself, why are we going back? Because we have very effective vaccines against measles. Well, in part, there's bad science, and even when it is retracted, as we will see later, people still rely on it. And sometimes it's just completely ridiculous. So I found this thing. People don't vaccinate their dogs. They don't want their dogs to develop autism. And a vet says, I had a client concerned about an autistic child who didn't want to vaccinate the dog for the same reason. We've never diagnosed autism in a dog. I don't think that you could. So just kind of gets ridiculous at some point. Which brings us to the bigger issue of the spread of misinformation. That has been a problem for a while now. We know that it poses a big risk to societies worldwide. There's a lot of effort to correct misinformation, but it's still very difficult. And the question is, why is it so complicated? And there's a general theory that suggests that it's very difficult to correct misinformation because it has this continued influence effect. This idea that even when information in our memory is corrected, replaced, outdated, we still tend to rely on it. So when we try to correct that misinformation, it's not necessarily the case that we can bring people back to where they were before they were exposed to the original falsehoods. And just maybe to show you a real world case of the continued influence effect, probably kind of one of the most archetypical cases is this mouthwash Listerine. And I don't know if you've ever used Listerine, it's quite popular in the US. If you have a case of bad breath, that might help. For sure, it's not going to help you with a sore throat or with colds, but for nearly 50 years, Listerine was advertised basically as a treatment to reduce the severity of colds and sore throats without zero. There was no evidence ever that it can do either of those things. So it took 50 years, but the Federal Trade Commission, the commission in the US that is responsible to make sure that everything operates accurately, decided that now Listerine needs to pay for what they've done, and they need to finance their own correction campaign. And the correction campaign was very expensive, and it was across a variety of media. The findings of the studies that evaluated the efficacy of the campaign were really depressing. 42% of Listerine users, they just thought that the correction campaign was wrong. They thought that it was still effective in preventing colds and sore throats. More than half of the users actually said that they bought the product because of its ability to treat sore throats and prevent colds. And again, there were no evidence that it can do either of those things. Yeah, but that all happened many, many years ago. Obviously, now we know that Listerine is not a treatment for sore throats. Well, earlier today, I actually checked. This is a popular blog called livestrong.com. So they're not showing Listerine, but obviously it is Listerine. And they're telling us most people know how to swish and gurgle for oral hygiene, but when and how to relieve a sore throat is a less common knowledge. So again, the same misinformation from 50 years ago is repackaged and coming back, and still people till this day continue to believe in it. But this is all nice, and I'm giving you a bunch of anecdotal stuff, but you're a serious scientist and you're asking me, well, what is the empirical research telling us? Well, the empirical research is a mess. There are studies that show no evidence for the continued influence of misinformation across a variety of topics. Same scholars, by the way, show very strong evidence some of them other work for the continued influence of misinformation effect. And there's a nice category of studies that show a boomerang effect. This is really interesting. In this case, not only that the correction is not effective, the correction actually increases people's reliance and belief in the misinformation. So the literature is a mess. What we often want to do in this case is kind of try to organize it with some research. So before I talk about the first meta-analysis, let's ask the question, why is it so hard to correct misinformation? Basically, what are the explanations for this continued influence of misinformation? And probably the first explanation, the most obvious, has to do with memory. So let me test your memory. Sherlock Holmes said elementary, or did he say elementary, my dear Watson? You can write in the chat, you can say, most people remember it as elementary, my dear Watson. However, he never said it in the books. In the film Snow White, was it mirror, mirror on the wall or magic mirror on the wall? For some reason, many people remember it as mirror, mirror, but actually it's magic mirror. I want to show you now a real life case of this problem that we have with our memory. So in the build up to the 2016 elections, as part of the debates, then candidate Trump was asked about his sketchy record with talking about vaccines and autism. He was basically asked to clarify his previous statements, and he said, people that work for me, just the other day, 2-year-old, beautiful child, went to have the vaccine and came back, and a week later got a tremendous fever, got a very, very sick, now is autistic. So in a perfect reality, you wanted this debate to stop and now let the expert clarify the misunderstanding. And this is exactly what CNN have done. So they have their house expert, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, and he explained exactly what was wrong. There's a very interesting study that tracked what happened to viewers of CNN. And they found, again, something quite depressing. As you can see, it didn't really matter whether people remember that it was Trump who said it or not. It didn't really matter whether people were Democrats, Republicans, whether they supported Trump. Before the correction of CNN, people are very misinformed. After the correction, their level of accuracy goes up, but then 1 week later comes down again. So memory is one suspect. The other suspect is what we often refer to as mental models. This idea that to understand reality, we need to come up with a story about reality. And the more coherent the story is, the more difficult it is to correct it. So for instance, if we have a very coherent story that Bill Gates is paying doctors to vaccinate people, although they know that it's dangerous, it might be false, but it's very coherent. And this approach suggests that if we just gonna invalidate, address one element of the mental model, let's say doctors are actually nice, they wanna help you, people are left with a gap. All of a sudden, their mental model becomes incoherent. And study after study show, and this is quite interesting, that people will go back to the false model, even though they sometimes know that it's incorrect, just because it is more coherent. So that's another suspect, mental models. The third suspect, I'll just ask you a question, right? It's very easy. 2, right? Well, in reality, Moses wasn't on the ark. Moses didn't take anyone on the ark. That was Noah. But because it is so fluent, because it's so obvious, we don't stop. We're just not alone. By the way, if I were to show it like this, in a disfluent font, less people are likely to make the mistake. Which one is a safer roller coaster? The fluent one, a Hanzi, is safer because it's fluent, it's more familiar than I can't even pronounce this. Which drug is safer? Some terrifying research on drug names and safety. Timolin, because it is more fluent, easier to pronounce. By the way, which drug is more effective? Often people say that disfluent sounds familiar, sounds different. So this idea of fluency and familiarity, the kind of metacognitive experience where what sounds familiar, what feels familiar is also safe. The thing that often, the easiest manipulation of fluency is just repetition. The more we repeat something, the more it sounds familiar, it feels familiar, it feels safe. Imagine the last time that you reviewed an article, for instance, for a journal. If you find yourself just nodding alone, agreeing with everything, there's a good chance that this article will be accepted because you're probably agreeing with everything. Everything sounds familiar. Maybe not accepted for a very good journal. It's not innovative enough if everything is so familiar. So that's another suspect, right? Repetition, repeating the same things increases fluency. Another reason could be motivated reasoning, which is people are motivated to discount information that challenges their worldview, like a confirmation bias, essentially. What agrees with us, we judge to be true. What disagrees with us is obviously false. And the way that I like to think about it is really there are 2 ways in which we process information. One is driven by our goal to be as accurate as possible when there's a target and we want to be accurate. and one that is driven by directional goals, where we want to be consistent, where we already kind of reach the conclusion and we paint the target around that arrow. And I often think about kind of the irony that like if you buy something very expensive, like a new television, we often read the manual because we want to be accurate. We want to make sure that we're not doing something to harm it. Like we're not using directional goals, right? We're not telling ourselves, because I want this button to turn it off, it will turn it off. So we're not doing this. But for some reason, when it comes to really important things like our environment and politics and health, we kind of rely more on directional goals. So that's another way to think about it. And probably one of the most interesting examples from recent years of this dynamic, you can see on the left, that's the crowd in Obama's inauguration. On the right is the crowd from Trump's inauguration. Now, clearly, there are more people for Obama. Well, unless you're a Trump supporter. So Trump supporters were asked which photo is from which inauguration. Nearly half of them, of Trump supporters, confused the two inaugurations. That kind of makes sense. Maybe they just didn't know for some reason. The next statistics is just terrifying. Of those that did know, 15% said that there were more people in the picture that is clearly shows fewer people in the crowd. Again, this reliance on directional goals. Another potential reason I just want to briefly mention has to do with trust and credibility. We know that trust and credibility is gradually eroding, and that might influence the limited ability of organizations like the CDC, the FDA, WHO to address misinformation. Rand Paul, a popular politician in the US, says, we shouldn't presume that a group of experts somehow knows what's best. And then for the final suspect, I want to talk with you a little bit about cockroaches. So will you eat one cherry from a bowl of cockroaches? Most people would say no, nah. And I agree with you, it's a silly question. Who would eat one cherry from a bowl like a lot of cockroaches? How about only one cockroach? Will you? But it's one and it's tiny, and most people would say no. Surely another example. Look at these faces. Look at these faces. Now, theoretically, I could ask you, what was the first face that you focused on? I don't need to. I know, not because I'm a magician, because we're all wired in the same way. I know that it's always the angry face. We're biased toward the negative faces, toward the angry faces. Makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective, right? We want to be safe in our environment. People that are angry are a direct risk. So there's this idea that negative information is stickier than positive information because it draws our attention quicker and for a longer period of time. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the misinformation is negative, right? They're harvesting baby parts. You know, pandemic is coming. The correction is often, hey, vaccines are safe. You know, the good thing. The bad thing is usually, the conspiracy is usually the misinformation. So this is our list of suspects. And now I want to talk about the studies. So the first one that I want to talk about is a meta-analysis, just trying to understand the lay of the land. What's happening here with the continued influence effect? Is it real? Is it not? Conducted a literature search, started with a bunch of relevant databases, found relevant studies, went to the reference lists, searched for conference papers, contacted 12 leading scholars, basically any person who had some kind of misinformation in their CV, we reached out to them. And then our inclusion criteria for this study were, we wanted experimental studies that directly compare between conditions that were exposed to misinformation that was later corrected and an equivalent neutral control. because that gives us the contrast that we need, right? People that are exposed to misinformation, it is corrected, versus people that never saw the misinformation. Because if there's no significant difference, it tells us there's no continued influence. It went exactly to where it was before. If there is a significant difference, then obviously the correction didn't erase the exposure to misinformation. Also, we cared that the misinformation and the correction are not presented in the same message. We want to give people some time to process it, and we focused on effects on beliefs and on attitudes. So this is how we get from nearly or more than 1,400 studies to about 32 studies. Quite a lot of them were unpublished. So what's the main effect of continued influence of misinformation? It's weak, very weak, but significant. So nothing to write home about, but still there's something there. More interesting for me personally, heterogeneous. So the effect size is heterogeneous, which means there's all this variance, and we need to explain it somehow. Best way to explain variance is to look at moderators, these variables that can introduce some order, some logic into this mess called the misinformation literature. So going back to our suspects, mental models, we wanted to see whether there's a difference in the effect of continued influence between misinformation that was coherent and misinformation that was low in coherence. And what we found, nothing. There was no significant difference. But then we looked at the correction. Does it matter when the correction is coherent, when it's not only says this didn't happen, but it tells an alternative story about reality? And this is what we find. Yes, when the misinformation was, when the correction was coherent, the effect of continued influence was weaker, which is great. But more interestingly, we looked at the interaction between the coherence of the misinformation and the coherence of the correction. What we find is this is the biggest problem. When high coherence misinformation encounters low coherence correction, this is where you get the strongest continued of influence effect. Moving to fluency, that idea of repetition and familiarity, indeed, there's a significant effect of repetition. Each repetition makes the misinformation stickier, more difficult to correct. Interestingly, it didn't matter if the misinformation was repeated within the correction or not, because sometimes we hear people say, don't repeat the misinformation in the correction. So at least according to this literature, it didn't really have the same effect. Unsurprisingly, it's easier to correct misinformation when it disagrees with our pre-existing attitudes. That's a kind of study number 2000, finding support for the confirmation bias. Also, interestingly, source credibility seems to matter for misinformation. So when the person spreading the misinformation had higher source credibility, the continued influence of misinformation had a stronger effect. The depressing finding, not the same for correction. So it didn't matter whether the source of the correction had high source credibility or a lower source credibility. But it did matter if the same source was spreading the misinformation and later correcting the misinformation. This is how you get a weaker, and in this case, kind of no significant effect of a continued influence of the misinformation. Negativity bias, we didn't find any support for the negativity bias of the misinformation. Also, not for the correction. So what's the conclusion here? Correction of misinformation does not entirely revert people's attitudes and beliefs to their baseline level, meaning the continued influence effect is real, but on average, it's very, very weak. But still, across all studies, you find this average effect. Repetition, credibility, and coherence of the misinformation, coupled with a low coherence correction, result in the greatest continued misinformation effect. But the effect is diminished when the correction is consistent with the message recipient's worldview and it is attributed to the source of misinformation. So reflecting on these findings, we thought, well, basically what we need is more corrections that have some credibility, that provide a coherent explanation as opposed to just negating the misinformation. And then we thought, oh, we basically just invented fact-checking, right? We already have fact-checking, so maybe fact-checking is the way to go. So kind of the next project was a meta-analysis of fact-checking. I'll just briefly say that remember that example with Trump and vaccines and autism. So this is very different, right? Here, to some degree, that could be an ideal correction. They provide all the context, they explain everything, they provide the science, they provide the studies. This is excellent. This is excellent correction. So maybe fact-checking is the solution. We define fact-checking as the practice of systematically publishing assessments of the validity of claims made by public officials and institutions with an explicit attempt to identify whether a claim is factual or not. It's certainly popular. There's an increase in the use of fact-checking. It wins a lot of journalism awards. The question is whether it is effective. It's a separate question. So again, meta-analysis in general, as far as I see it, is built on this really beautiful assumption that says there's no such thing as the perfect study. Right? Every study has its limitations, and as long as this bias, as long as this error is not systematic, when you pull them all together, when you combine all of them together, you can get at the true effect. Oh, it's kind of easier said than done and oversimplification of reality, but at least there's something very elegant about this approach. So there are two broad theoretical frameworks around fact-checking. One, something that we already mentioned, it has to do with motivated reasoning and this idea that fact-checking has limited ability to persuade those that resist it. So based on this, we hypothesize that it will be stronger for pro-attitudinal corrections when the correction already agrees with you, stronger for Democrats and liberals, at least in the US. Republicans and conservatives are more likely to be fact-checked. They have more negative attitudes towards fact-checking. And at least in the three most recent election cycles, the conservative or Republican candidate was the one that was anti-fact-checking, and the Democrat liberal was for fact-checking. It's weaker for politically sophisticated individuals, just like any other effect in political communication. Those that already understand politics, they are not that influenced by one message. And it's going to be weaker for election or campaign statements, because this is when kind of party identities and motivated reasoning should be at its peak compared to non-campaign time, just routine times. And then the other set of hypotheses came from just message design research, where we hypothesize that it will be stronger when the fact-checking message is accompanied by truth scales, such as these. It will be stronger with simple messages, because checkers are notorious for complicating things. And it will be stronger for complete refutations, meaning when the message is completely false, as opposed to partially false. So this is, again, kind of similar approach to select the studies. In this case, we were interested in comparing experimental conditions that were exposed to fact-checking with a completely equivalent control. So fact-checking versus no fact checking. We said that it has to be in the political context, because otherwise it's not very comparable to other fact checkers, and it needs to expressly name a real or a fictitious fact checker. Again, we're looking at the effects on beliefs and attitudes, and this is how we get from nearly 5,000 studies to about 30 studies. In that case, it was 50% of them were unpublished. I remember chasing people in conferences and begging them to send me their unpublished work. So thanks to all of the people who did send it. The main effect of fact checking on beliefs is, kind of weak, moderate effect, but again, significant. Also heterogeneous, meaning let's look at those moderators to make sense of what is going on here. Before we look at the moderators, I want to show you something, because one of the things that I said early on, we talked about this backfire effect, as if exposure to the correction has a negative effect on accuracy. And as you can see here, there's some studies that are non-significant, but there's no such thing. It's always a positive effect. There's absolutely no reason to think that the backfire effect is real. So pre-existing beliefs, unsurprisingly, when the pro-attitudinal fact-checking happens, you get stronger effects of fact checkers. Also, for politically sophisticated individuals, as we suspected, weaker effects, so increase in political sophistication, decreases the efficacy of fact checkers. In terms of political affiliation and ideology, we didn't find difference between Democrats and Republicans. But when we look at the interaction, this is quite interesting. We find that Republicans and conservatives are both more likely to accept fact checkers that agree with them, and also less likely to accept fact checkers that disagree with them. And we don't get quite the same differences with Democrats and liberals. As one might suspect, fact checking during campaigns, during times that are highly polarizing, is less effective. And in terms of visual elements, this is quite surprising. We found a significant effect, but in the opposite direction. Maybe something that we can kind of be curious to see if you have better explanations than I do. Apparently, when visuals are included, there's a weaker effect of fact checkers. Lexical complexity, so we analyze the sophistication, word variation, and verb variation, and non-variation. And what we found, as we predicted, that lexical complexity has a negative effect on fact checking. So the more complicated the text is, the less effect it will have. And then we also looked at refutation type, refuting the entire statement versus partial refutation. And again, we see the significant difference. When the entire statement was refuted, obviously it has a stronger effect compared to a more ambiguous version of the findings. So the finding from this meta-analysis, it's really, you can take it each way you want to. The optimistic reading is, no matter what was the context, fact-checking works. There's no reason to think that there's a backfire effect. The realistic or pessimistic approach would say the closer it resembles real life, because these are experiments, meaning it sometimes disagrees with us, it happens during election, the weaker the effects are. And the weaker the effects are, at some point it kind of becomes a very, very weak and almost negligible effects. So the kind of final question that I'll try to answer today is why fact-checking has these limited effects, or at least propose an explanation. One obvious reason is, like we said, motivated reasoning. just like anything else, fact checkers, it's not a golden solution, not a gold bullet. It's not going to bypass the resistance that we have to incongruent information. Most people, they not process political information with accuracy goals. We usually process it with consistency goals. The other explanation is a little bit more interesting. And this idea that was first proposed by Pennycook and Rand, that basically said, in part, what makes fact checkers so unique is also their limitation. They focus only on what can be fact checked. Now, a lot of political talk can't be fact checked. So it falls within that gray area of opinions, predictions. But often when people are exposed to fact checking, they see a very long text and only one statement that was fact checked. Now, the question is whether they realize that everything that was not fact checked is an opinion and not a checkable claim. Because if they don't, and this is something that Pennycook and Rand call the implied truth effect, the implication is, hey, look at this hour-long speech by the president, only 3 false statements. Well, maybe that's the only 3 checkable claims in the entire speech. And there's a really good reason to suspect that this is a problem. At least in the US, Pew Research had a really cool idea. They gave people, thousands of people, 5 fact-based statements and 5 opinion-based statements. So just to clarify, when I say fact-based, I'm not saying that it's accurate. I'm just saying that it can be checked. It's a factual statement. Opinion statement, again, I'm not saying that it's true or not. I'm just saying that it is based in people's kind of personal opinions. For instance, democracy is the greatest form of government. That would be an opinion statement. Spending on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid makes up the largest portion of the US federal budget. That would be a fact-based statement. The findings are devastating. Only of all the people that participated, thousands of people, only 26% got all the 5 fact-based statements correctly, and only 35% were accurate when classifying opinion-based statements. So that might be a real problem. I just want to show you 3 really brief experiments that try to kind of zero in on that question. In the first experiment, we just took 152 participants and randomly assigned them. They all read a news article about gun-related policy that included 5 fact-based statements. Everyone. Now, it was a simple 2-by-2 where some were exposed to a congruent article. So we had 2 versions. One version was all about gun control. We need fewer guns, more restrictions on gun ownership. And one was about gun rights, fewer restrictions, we need more guns. Now in the US, guns is a very, very political, very value-laden topic. And we also, for half of the participants, beyond the 5 fact-based statements, we also included 5 opinion-based statements. Now, these opinion-based statements are on the same topic as the fact-based statements, so they don't add new information, they just add more opinions. And we looked at the effects on speaker credibility and message accuracy. What we find, just some examples. Fact-based claims were identified as those that relate to historical data, comparisons, legality, and statistics. For instance, virtually 100% of shooters have some kind of a mental illness history. And opinion-based statements were those pertaining to general future predictions, values, and personal judgments. The real problem is stemming from mental illness and not easy access to guns. So again, same topic, opinion, and fact-based. And importantly, both versions, the gun control and the gun rights, were logically equivalent. So for instance, both articles included the statement, a percent of shooters have some kind of mental illness history. When it was gun rights, we said 100%, which is false. When it was gun control, we said 33%, which is false. The real answer is just in the middle, 68. So it's always logically equivalent. What we find, first of all, so you can see the blue one is effects on message accuracy. The green one is the level of source credibility. Significant effect on message congruency, meaning that when the information in the article was congruent, people thought that the speaker is more credible and the message more accurate. That's an obvious finding, but also significant effect on message checkability. When the opinion-based statements appeared with the facts, people thought that the source was more credible and the message was more accurate. We didn't find interaction between the two in this study. So it seems to be the case that maybe Rand and Pennycook are onto something. Maybe when we include opinions with facts, maybe it does something to our processing. So our next study was a bit larger, and this time we again manipulated the congruency with the exact same manipulation, but we also manipulated whether the articles was fact-checked or not fact-checked. And these articles all included 5 opinion and 5 fact-based statements, because the obvious limitation of the previous study was, well, one group just read a somewhat longer message. It included maybe more statements. Again, we measured message credibility, we measured message accuracy, and we also measured message checkability. So we asked people whether each statement was fact-based or opinion-based. So for instance, we don't have enough laws that restrict guns in America. That's obviously an opinion-based statement. Buying a firearm at a store or other federal firearms licensees require a federal background check. That would be a fact-based statement. The results, we found significant effect of misinformation congruence. You know, the obvious thing, when it agrees with you, we think that they're more credible, more accurate, and also a significant effect of fact-checking. So fact-checking had a positive effect. But the interesting question for us was, are the effects of fact-checking on speaker credibility and accuracy contingent or moderated by people's ability to discern fact from opinion-based statements? So again, this idea that when people don't distinguish fact from opinions, fact-checking is not helpful for them. And this is exactly what we found. So 2 significant moderations, and here you see, so the green line is a no fact-checking condition. It's not really interesting, right? There's no correction going on there. This gives us basically the baseline. People that are low on checkability, meaning those that are not doing a great job distinguishing facts from opinions, they think that the speaker is credible even after the article was fact-checked. People that are high on checkability, they're doing a much better job. So for them, fact-checking seemed to work a bit better. And almost identical results for message accuracy. Low checkability, fact-checking is not very effective. High checkability, much more effective. So the third study, we kind of ask ourselves, well, there are 2 explanations here. One, people are not good. They just don't know what is a fact and what is an opinion. The other explanation is they know and they are misclassifying opinions as facts and facts as opinions to serve their political ideology. So what would be the best way to override this effect? Well, we can pay people and tell them, and if they're going to do a good job classifying fact and opinion-based statements, they're going to get a big payment. So this is what we've done. We've manipulated their motivation. For 1/3 of them, we said the top 3 performers on the message checkability detection test will receive a bonus of $40. And we actually gave $40 to the top 3 performers. For 1/3, we said, remember that you had selected and what they selected as their political ideology, with the goal of being as consistent as possible. Answer those questions. And for 1/3, just a neutral control, no instructions. And this is what we get. And kind of 2 interesting points here. A, it seems to be the case that when we pay people, they know much better how to distinguish fact from opinion. So it's not kind of an inherent inability, it's just motivation. But more interestingly, when we can compare the consistency goals to the control, it tells us something about the default, which is, it seems to be that our default looks more like consistency goals than accuracy goals, which is might be a problem. And we also looked at kind of the mediation of this and found that accuracy goals compared to consistency goals increased message checkability, as we've seen from the previous figure, and that message checkability had a negative effect on accuracy and credibility, which is good. So just to conclude, this study, pro-attitudinal fact-checking seemed to outperform corrective information that runs counter to people's ideological views. That's obvious. The efficacy of fact checkers seem to be also influenced by the ability to discern fact from opinion-based claims. And it's not entirely that people are not able to do it. It has more to do with motivation, which just tells us we have a steep hill to climb, because it's not clear how you motivate people to be more judgmental or to be more careful when processing information. So this exclusive focus of fact checking on fact-based statements is part of their weakness, because as far as some people think, if there's only 1 statement or 5 statements that were checked in a very long article, well, maybe it means that the other statements are actually accurate, and that's a problem. So, maybe we can talk about this a little bit later. It seems that continued influence of misinformation is real. Fact-checking has limitations. We have a lot of work to do. And the kind of challenge, and be curious to hear about your ideas here, is how do you get people on the one hand not to have blind faith in something, on the other hand not to be cynical toward information, but how to be kind of healthy skepticism. Thank you so much. Can't wait to hear your thoughts and critiques and comments.